This is Larry Rosenthal of the Goldman School with Step 6, Confront the Trade-offs. Some tips. First, we'll have some general observations about this step of the Eightfold Path, and we'll look at two key elements involved in this trade-off step. Then we'll take a careful look at an example of a policy trade-off. And lastly, we'll have some comments on the limits of commensurability. First, some general observations. Recall where we've been. The prior step of the Eightfold Path, projecting the outcomes, involved predicting how each of our alternatives will perform in practice, and then gauging those outcomes in terms of the criteria we've selected. By contrast, here at this next step, confronting the trade-offs, we're going to look and see how each alternative performs relative to all other alternatives across all of the outcomes that we've projected. It's difficult to summarize all the ways that this trade-offs step of the Eightfold Path works in practice. It's best learned via experience, and we'll have an example that we hope will instruct you on how to think about trade-offs as you get started. Trade-offs often involve creating a logic of comparison or commensurability, and this will help you lay the groundwork for identifying the best alternative and crafting a meaningful and persuasive recommendation for your client. And recall that the Outcomes Matrix tool will help you organize your work and reach success. Now, two key elements of trade-offs. First, we will review each alternative's unique combination of advantages and disadvantages, and then we'll identify which alternative should be found to predominate overall. Once we make that identification, we've really completed the trade-offs process, and we're ready for the next step of the Eightfold Path, deciding. In rare instances, one alternative's outcomes dominate others as to all criteria. What this means really is that there are no trade-offs to confront. But in the absence of such overall dominance, the process involves weighting outcomes in some fashion, and that means determining how some outcomes may outweigh others, and then developing the reasons why this is so. Let's look at an example of a policy trade-off. Consider a congested highway bridge where two alternatives are under consideration. Either we can add a bridge lane or we can meter traffic. Also, imagine that two criteria have been selected. First, minimizing total project cost, and next, maximizing the reduction of delays. Here's an example of a matrix that might be constructed in this circumstance. The alternatives are in the rows marked the lane for adding the lane to the bridge or introducing metering, and the columns are the criteria as to total cost and the change in vehicle delay. In this circumstance, allow the lane to cost $50 million as a project, while the metering system will only cost $5 million, and that the delay change for adding the lane to the bridge would be 20 minutes on average saved, whereas for the metering system, only half that will be saved, 10 minutes on average. And these average minutes saved would be per vehicular trip, for example. So we have a trade-off. Metering saves the most money. It costs only $5 million compared to the $50 million cost of the lane project, while adding the lane reduces delays best. It saves twice as much time on average as metering does. Continuing with this example of a policy trade-off, let's carry forward this 2x2 table, our outcomes matrix, 2 alternatives, 2 criteria. Confronting the trade-off here means not only describing the interaction among these alternatives' outcomes, but also translating them, or just combining criteria in some way. Here we can say that the lane reduces average delay at a cost of about $2.5 million per minute, and that equals the $50 million total project cost divided by the 20 minutes on average saved. While metering does so for only $0.5 million per minute, and we arrive at that by taking its total project cost, $5 million, and dividing it by the 10 minutes on average saved. Let's add a column to our outcomes matrix, having performed this analysis, and we can see that in that column of cost effectiveness, we have a commensurate measure, the amount of dollars spent per minute of delay saved. Weighting cost effectiveness as the most important factor here would make metering the winning alternative, and it would create a sense of commensurability relative to cost and performance. Now let's talk about the limits of commensurability. Trade-offs are obviously simplified when all the outcomes can be monetized, translated into dollars, or quantified into some other convertible unit other than dollars. When this is possible, the net impacts can be summed easily, and the trade-offs across criteria are essentially eliminated. We get a clear winner. However, when less quantifiable criteria, such as fairness, are involved, monetizing these outcomes cannot be achieved as easily. However, even in those circumstances, what Bardach calls break-even questions may still help. For example, how much would I have to value fairness in order to choose alternative A over alternative B? This will help us think in commensurate terms, even though one of our criteria, fairness, can't easily be translated into such terms. Regardless of how we face these difficulties with commensurability, completing this step of the Eightfold Path will require you as the analyst to weight policy impacts appropriately and then try to justify a clear choice, whether commensurability is easy or not. Reviewing, Step 6, Confront the Trade-offs, involved reviewing some general observations. We discussed the 2 key elements. We looked at an example of a policy trade-off, and then we addressed the limits of commensurability. That concludes this mini lecture on confronting the trade-offs.